everyone. This is Alan Shark, and it was a privilege to kind of serve as the lead for NAPA's Election 2020 Artificial Intelligence Agenda for 2020 and beyond. We are one of many projects that looked at what the transitional elements of any new president's administration might need to look at, or better yet, should look at. We had a number of useful meetings and lots of conversations and many drafts, and I want to recognize the people that were part of this group. First of all, we have Teresa Pardo, we have Eric Brigad, we have Kay Husbands-Phelan, we have Doug Robinson, James Hendler, and Tanya Thornton. Every one of these individuals, some of which are here today, had a major role to play in editing, discussing, helping think through what it is that we wrote. You can find our written report at the NEPA website. Our charge simply was to review current state of the art in artificial intelligence, to review progress to date regarding examples in AI and how it's being adopted by many government agencies. We were asked to identify key areas of concern to future administrations and to propose recommendations and a rationale where we thought it was appropriate. These are the areas that we looked at, and we're going to spend a few minutes looking at each of these. Building trustworthy AI was the lead, followed by identifying and reducing ethics and bias, and then building intergovernmental partnerships and knowledge sharing around the public sector, increasing investments in research and research translation to practice. Long sentence there. Yes, we recognize the need for more research, but we're also interested in the practical outcomes, kind of a balance of the two, and building an AI-ready workforce, what that might look like and why it's important. We have a number of issues we didn't get to, and hopefully the year coming we can start to do that. So with that, I'd like to turn to those who had the most to do, at least with the initial drafts of each of these topics. And I'm going to start with Teresa, who did Trustworthy AI. Teresa.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, everybody, it was an honor to work with you, and thanks to NAPA for the opportunity to be part of this important initiative. Trustworthiness of AI is a critically important conversation to have. It's a critically important area of research. There is current research into trustworthiness that tells us that most Americans, as we say in the report, lack confidence in the ability of any institution, including government, to manage AI development. And the reason that this matters is if we cannot build public trust in algorithmic decision-making, and the way we do that by creating more trustworthy AI that is reliable, that is explainable, that we can communicate with the public about, then the potential of AI won't be realized. It'll be rejected, and it'll lose its legitimacy over time. And so what's very, very important is to be able to think about what constitutes trustworthy AI. And we talk about reliability, explainability. Explainability, as an example, is that we must be able to explain the conclusions in terms that are understandable to humans. But we also have to think about privacy as an issue. We have to think about bias as an issue. And what that requires us to do is to think about how do we integrate considerations of ethics and ethical frameworks into the development of artificial intelligence related technologies, artificial intelligence initiatives. How do we integrate governance based on those ethical frameworks into the development process at every stage so that we have that trustworthiness. We can explain it, it's reliable. Otherwise, we're concerned about the potential of AI not being realized. So Alan, trustworthiness of AI, it's really very, very critical, and we have to get better at it. We have to be able to understand how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. We fully agree. But almost as important, if not equally important, is the whole issue of ethics and bias. They really go hand in hand. And we wrestled with it. Should this all be in one or should be in two? And I think since we love to have bullet points in our reports, we kind of flush them out into two. So Eric and Kay, why don't you share with us your thoughts on the ethics and bias? Start with you, Eric.
Thank you, Alan. And Kay and I collaborated on this section. I think it's worth noting what was happening in the United States as we were all working on this report. There were great conversations all across the country about bias. not specifically about AI, but AI became part of the national conversation. So one of our concerns at the outset is with biased data, AI systems will produce biased results. And so how are we going to address this as part of our report? Some of the questions that came up, how do you ensure ethical decision making? Is it appropriate, and if so, when, to use unexplainable AI systems in ways that significantly impact human beings? What are leading practices for developing these AI systems that can be used by humans in ways that improve the human condition? So we wrestled with a lot. And ultimately, we encouraged the administration of Congress next year moving forward to consider a range of issues, ethical and moral questions, greater public education about the benefits as well as the risks of AI. How about regulatory frameworks and guidelines? And you'll see that there's an overlap with a lot of the sections here in this report. Legislation linked to current as well as future ethical issues, and the proper relationship between technology, society, and public law. There are a lot of organizations that we looked at that have already started the foundation of an ethical framework. We cite the American Society for Public Administration's Code of Ethics. We cite the Association for Computing Machinery, to mention another group that has provided some industry guidance in AI ethics training. So we considered a lot. And as Teresa mentioned in the first section, as you think about transparency, it's hard to think about transparency in a vacuum without considering ethics and bias.
Okay, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I would just underscore exactly what Eric and Teresa beforehand mentioned about fairness and how important is it to ensure that the research behind artificial intelligence and its use is critically important to push forward right now, because sometimes the technology is running a bit faster than we understand in terms of its applications. We need to understand better differences, incompatibility, explainability. We need to make sure that we have appropriate understanding of things that are not interpretable and how it has an impact on human beings. And so it really is essential for us to unpack all of these terms and issues and begin to speed up the way in which we understand these applications, including in the public sector and in public administration, because the technology is running quickly and we need to make sure that the adoption is well understood and put in place and that there's guidance in how that should occur.
That's very helpful. I'm going to introduce you in a minute. I was just going to say that I want to have a disclaimer here. None of us are pretending to be experts in artificial intelligence, but we are blessed with one, and that is Dr. Hendler. Jim is our provocateur and has been our guiding light in many ways, who spent over 30, 40 years in all of this and really working on it. So I want to turn to you, Jim. I know you want to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, Alan, that what I think is really crucial in understanding all the things we've just been talking about is, and this is kind of mentioned in our report as a cross-cutting theme, is the fact that this AI technology, the real problem at the moment is we don't know how to categorize its accuracy in different contexts, in different roles. So when we talk about bias and ethics, we often focus on a particular system or a particular application, but there's actually a much more general problem. I often use the analogy, we wouldn't allow in courts the use of fingerprints until we were able to say with a certain accuracy, with a certain number of features, et cetera, then we would get a 99% match, or 1 person in a million. DNA technology is another one. We don't really have to understand how the DNA matching algorithms work once we understand and have reached consensus on the fact that when you get something that says this is 1 in a million matches, all the scientists or all the people who are looking at this from a policy point of view agree. But with this AI technology, we're not there yet. We have people being arrested based on face recognition technology, which is not only biased in terms of things, human features, gender, race, age, physical ability, but also things like lighting impact. The picture of me sitting here trained to an AI system is going to look very different than if a cop car is driving down the street and walks past me. So really a key part of what we're arguing for is understanding from both a regulatory and use point of view that we're really not there yet. That when this system says, I'm 90% sure that that's Jim Hendler in that picture, it's not. And we don't know what it is, and we need to categorize that. So all of this fits into that bigger picture, I think. And so the next recommendations we're going to get to really get to the fact that to handle these things we've just talked about, we're going to need to move ahead with really understanding some of the research into these kind of policy issues, not how to make it better at doing a task, but at really understanding how well it's doing.
That is a perfect segue to the next two, at least, and that is, the idea of intergovernmental relations among the various institutions. What can we learn from each other through experience? Everyone's using things. Some call it AI. One could argue, is it really AI or machine learning? But the point is, there are things happening that are moving towards an automated kind of environment that we lack some controls. That's what I'm hearing, and we're worried about the inherent built-in biases that we know exist by examples already. So one of the things we looked at is Doug Robinson, who could not be with us today. One of the authors talked about a study that they did among state CIOs. Everyone thinks that AI is just something that's happening, in a couple of federal agencies. And what we have learned is it's far more than that. His study that was conducted last year looked at a very high percentage of state CIOs, state chief information officers, that consider this a real priority. And they started pointing in areas of which they would find AI most useful and most helpful. Now, the White House, in fact, Jim and I were honored to be invited to the White House, the first White House AI symposium. And they had all sorts of wonderful things that they were talking about, things that they were going to do. And it was a good learning experience. They certainly have put some effort, they being the White House, into this. In some very specific terms. And recently they've actually put some money into this, at least for some research. So one of the things that they talked about initially was, providing more assistance to federal agencies. And I think we as a group believe that that's fine, but we also think there's value in including other localities and working with institutions of higher learning. And that leads to the next one, which is more research funding. We need to understand and we need to learn from both the experiences that are occurring now. I mean, the private sector isn't waiting. They're already doing things that are called AI. And that's suspect whether it isn't, but they're calling it that, and they are automating systems. And the things that we're talking about are just as important. And so we have to learn and evaluate these experiences. We cannot just leave it to the private communities and say, oh, we have self-certified. We're going to tell you it's okay. We really need some objective studies. So yes, we're calling for more research. We're calling for more intergovernmental cooperation. And I think that sums up that third and fourth areas. Anything else you want to add to that in terms of our request and recommendation for more resources from both a pure end and an applied end? Okay, we're pretty much in agreement. And the last point, however, is the idea of if we're making recommendations to a future administration or an administration with new staff, one of the things that we feel is very important is that we re-examine what we're doing to prepare our workforce for the future. And many of us, because we're part of the academy, work in public affairs, public policy, public administration. And I did a study a couple of years ago and found that many people among faculty felt that they were unprepared and in some cases uninterested, that this wasn't part of their thing, that was something for the engineering school or for the science school or computer sciences. Jim and I have had some interesting conversations. We approach this from different angles, and Teresa and I are kind of, I think, aligned in this as well. I think we all are actually, in the sense that we need to have a broader view of influence from different sources. In other words, we need to have policy people. We need to have those in the humanities involved in this. And when we look at the skills of the future, it's not just computing skills, it's those soft skills. And I've always been troubled by the word soft skills. I now see a movement that I seem to like, and that is maybe we should call these professional skills, which kind of lies that they're less than technical, or less technical meaning emotional intelligence, skills in leadership, skills in understanding processes, data analytics, those kind of skills, and to really drill in and use what's going on in the country as good examples. I mean, it's just becoming a laboratory of things going on, and we don't have enough people understanding what's going on and why. Anyone else like to add to that little discussion?
So, Alan, if I may, this is Teresa. I'd like to jump in. So,
Sure.
I think you raise a really good point that this is a cross-disciplinary challenge, right? And we need to be able to think about all of the various facets of both research, development, adoption, use, regulation. So to kind of go back to I think an earlier point, maybe that you made, is the role of government as we think about AI, and there is a new new individuals, let's call them, looking at AI, thinking about AI, AI in government, AI regulated by government, and AI accelerated by government, right? And so they're very, very different roles, and they require very, very different expertise. But I think we have to message that they are different. And when we think about the use of data, right, and we think about data stewards and data users. So government is a data user, but government is also a data steward. And I think that concept applies here, is that government must be a user because we believe there's value there. But we're also regulators when we think about the private sector and applications there. But we're also accelerators, right? So we're also funding and driving the cutting edge. So I think it's important to really understand not only the facets that we need to attend to in terms of the workforce and research and development, but the different roles that government and government officials have to play at all levels.
I think what's really cool about the audience is the fact that when we look at the NAPA members, the fellows in particular, we come from all over the country. Some of us in the federal government, some of us in the research institutions, some of us are teaching in the fields of public policy administration. I think this speaks not only to a new transition group having to do with a transition of power or the presidency, but to everything that we do in every day. This is so current. I think that's why we all got so excited in this.
And let me just throw in one last thing, Alan, which is that, I think the growing awareness within the government, not just of the technology and its implications, which we've already discussed, but the need for this workforce development, to include the kind of topics we're saying. Just as one example, a bipartisan bill that was just recently introduced to the House would ask the National Science Foundation to invest in a program to actually design AI education for K-12, so for younger students, particularly focused on high school, but going all the way down. And the most interesting thing to me about it is the first draft of it, which came more from the professional side, was all about the technology. By the time the bill actually moved through the AI community and the people who are like the ones on this panel today, really was added to it ethics, bias, trustworthiness, things like that. So I think it's a growing awareness that this whole set of topics we just presented are really not separate topics, that they're all connected in a way that Alan sort of hinted at the beginning, and that, our report tries to pull them all together. And so I guess it's probably his role at the end to say, please go read the reports. I won't.
I could just add sentences. I think the implications, not only for the fellows of the Academy, but public managers, as well as those who are preparing the next workforce for not only the federal government, but as you mentioned, Alan, state governments as well. The implications are huge because you're not just talking about technical skills. How do you interweave ethics understanding? How do you resource the research that you're going to need, the funds that you're going to need? There's so many implications here, and I'm hoping this is a beginning of a conversation rather than a report that ends it.
Can I add one other thing? This is Kay, and that is what I was excited when I started working on this report with everyone on this call was to see the list of agencies that have already deployed some elements of artificial intelligence. So it wasn't something where we were saying, oh, this is coming. It was, there is a section of the report which really catalogs very effectively what is already going on. So I wanted to make that point about what is in the report. The second point I wanted to make, and something I think that everyone has said, and Teresa, you brought this up very pointedly, and that is, this is really about the integration of the work that's usually done oftentimes in the humanities and what is done in the social sciences, but also what is done in computing. Right now we're launching something similar to that at my institution. And it is part of this process is actually sitting down and having these different parts of our organization, parts of our university, talk to one another and to really try to understand what are we bringing to the table here. And so the research that Alan talked about, the education component that Jim just talked about, engagement with individuals that are typically outside the research community, all of that is necessary to really understand the things that we talked about: fairness, bias, adoption of these for the human condition. And so I just wanted to underscore those elements and say that the report really was, it really was a teaching moment for me about, well, how much of this is actually already going on in which agencies, in which departments. That was really interesting to me.
And it keeps growing. I mean, even since our report was first written, you know, a few months ago, I mean, more things could be added today, and it just keeps going. So let the record show this was recorded at a time before we handed everything over to the machines. And that we tried to instill a bit of conscience and reasoning and cautions before we go too far. That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm seeing. Now is the time to start making these kinds of issues, give them some life. It's like building something. If you can't finish something and say, you know, the foundation should have been 6 feet wider. What we're dealing now is the foundational elements of a growing science and a technology that has enormous implications. So I want to thank you all. It's been an honor working with you as a team. And yes, you're right, Jim. For those viewing this, go read the report.